Hi. Oh, that's very cool.
Welcome
Hi,
to
Juan
the
Pablo from Philippines.
welcome
Sorry.
to the Global Math Department. My name is Rana Arshid Hafiz, and I'll be your host tonight. Tonight, we are going to hear from Kat Hendry on Data Rich with Diagnostics. Would everyone please introduce themselves in the chat window, telling us what you teach, where, and what your Twitter handle is if you have one? We'll just wait for a minute before we introduce the speaker. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to explain how these meetings work. These meetings are recorded and are available within 24 hours after the meeting ends. To view the recording, you can use the same link as you used to get here tonight. The Global Math Department prides itself in being friendly and supportive. The chat room is available for typical and general conversation throughout the meeting. I'll be sure to catch your questions for the presenter to be addressed at the end of the presentation. Our speaker tonight is Kat Hendry, and I'm going to ask Kat to introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. Again, Kat Hendry. I'm from Kingston, Ontario, and on Twitter, I'm at Goslink123. I'm actually going to roll one slide forward just to introduce myself as well. So I've been teaching for about 17 years. I grew up in Kingston and went to school, University at Queen's, for a math degree. Loved math in high school, was not a big fan in elementary school, but something clicked and I fell in love with math a little bit later on. And taught internationally for a few years. And when I came back to Canada, I taught in 3 different boards. So I got a really good mix and dynamic of like what was happening in Southern Ontario or Southeastern Ontario. And taught a lot of math. I've taught mostly like 15 years worth of math and taught a little bit of art and photography when I first came back to Canada, and also taught lots of physics at various points in foods and ESL and special education. I think a lot of people have a bit of a mix when they first start, and have experience as an instructional coach, as a district facilitator, and taught statistics at the college level and pre-service education at the university level as well for teacher training. So that's a little bit about me. And part of the reason that I'm here tonight is because I am very, very passionate about diagnostics. I told my husband I was a little bit nervous about this evening, and he kind of laughed and he said, "You can talk for hours about diagnostics. I think you're set." So I do encourage everybody to comment and ask questions in the chat, and Rena and I will kind of keep check on here just to make sure that we answer anything as it comes up. But what I'm going to do is talk about a journey I took with a primary diagnostic project when I was a K-12 district facilitator, because that experience really opened my eyes up to diagnostics, at looking at them in a different way about how to plan a program. So I'm going to share the journey with you and talk about what the students and the teachers and I did using a Prime Diagnostic system, which is a system sold by Nelson. And in Ontario, many of the schools actually purchased the system, and it was already in most of our schools, which is why we chose that system. But you can do the same approach with any system as long as you get to know the system well. And I say play a couple of the games, but we're gonna like quote unquote play the games, and then understand how the games help to develop the skills in numeracy, and talk a little bit about reflection on that and how it's supported my understanding for how I should be using diagnostics for high school students. So the first thing we're going to look at is the primary diagnostic project, which was at a small rural school in about an hour and a half north of the city that I live in. And there's about 200 students there, K to 12. So it's a pretty small school. And we have a standardized test in Ontario called the EQAO. And the school had a low success rate. And so they were given resources to help promote more success with math to support the students. And so I was one of those resources that they were handed over. So we came up with kind of a plan to use prime number, and it is number sense and operations. And so we looked at prime number, and here's an example of a diagnostic question. And so prime was built by Marion Small, and who is very well known in North America, and it's an excellent resource. And things like her resources are well designed, and they've been very thoughtfully designed. So that's why we chose this. So we looked at this diagnostic question just as an example, and it says, so you show a number line, and then you cover up the numbers, and you reveal one by one. And so there's several numbers that would have been on, like we would have had separately as well. And so you can see I've kind of blanked out the spot right under the question. It says, what are these, or where are these numbers on the number line? So they were questions like numbers 3, 9, 14, and 17. And you'd say to the student, point to where the missing numbers should be on the line. So I would only reveal one number at a time and say 3, and then ask the student to point where 3 was. And then I would mark down where they said 3 was, and then 9. And then they'd point to where the 9 was or not. And the idea was that they were in the diagnostic, and how you mark it, it explains explicitly students that get 2 of the, or 3 of the 4 correct get 1 point. And if they don't, they get no point. Okay. So that's kind of how that sort of system works. And then what I did after that, after we learned about the diagnostic, we did some diagnostics together with the students and as a staff. And then what I did is I collected all these diagnostics for an entire primary division. So it was like not kindergarten. We did grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, grade 4, and we collated all the data. So this is a grade 1 class at the beginning of September, and this is their number diagnostic. And so what you'll see is like, here's all the students, and they're listed on the on the right-hand side. You'll see like A, B, C, all the way down to U. And so that's the students as they were in order. And what I did is I'd coded a Google Sheet so that we could share it. And I have the question written up at the top, so I knew what the question was. And they get 0 if they didn't understand the question or get the question or couldn't answer it, a 1 if they got it to some degree, and then a 2 if they got it completely. And so this is not my own coding for it, but this is actually from the diagnostic. It's just that the diagnostic was all paper and pencil. And so as a team, we decided we wanted to be able to share the results and talk about it and analyze it and look at it later on. And so the best way to do that was on a Google Sheet. So we did that. And one of the things that we also did is we rearranged it so that we would put the low score high and like sort it according to score. And it was really interesting because what we ended up noticing is we had like very stark gaps on certain things, but not big gaps on other things. And so we kind of looked at like, what were some of the gaps? Were they gaps because of instructional gaps? Were they gaps because they were like students had a hard time picking up the concept? Or were they curriculum gaps, like the students actually shouldn't know them yet? And so that's kind of the cool thing that happened with this diagnostic is what we found is, so these grade 1 students, so this data is for grade 1 class, as I mentioned before, and we had grade 1 on the diagnostic is around the phase 1, but it's not quite the phase 1. So it wouldn't be shocking to have a few students at the start of grade 1 still in kind of pre-phase 1 or just starting phase 1. And so what was kind of interesting is we noticed that, like, you can see how I've got that line all the way, the kind of purple, like pinky purple line or box around the second question. And the second question is about number lines. So it was, can a student place those numbers on that number line, like I showed before? And all of those red, that was actually more a concern because that was showing more of a whole class gap. Whereas other things, like which shape is third order, the students had a much better understanding of, and most of that was green. So that actually told us this is a whole class gap, or more of a class gap. And I think question number 3, it was a question about show me what half a pizza looks like. So we would cut out a circle and we would show, like, this is the circle, show me this. And then, like, here's a pair of scissors and cut it. And when the kids are older, we just ask them to draw it. But for the younger kids, it actually, I want to see if they can cut it, draw it, etc. And they'll tell you what they're most comfortable with. And I do all of these diagnostics when they were younger. I did them all by an interview. And when you're first doing diagnostics, I actually think interviews are the best way to learn your diagnostic system because you get a really good feel for who the students are, how they answer. And once you get a feel for that, it actually just helps you really understand how kids think and how they make logical sense of the world based on their logic. And so it actually gives you a really good grasp on what's going on in your classroom and in a kid's head, because there's not just one student that does things a certain way. There's usually lots of them that are doing them kind of like just off the beat a little bit. And so it was really eye-opening to spend, like, there's like 80 students that I did these diagnostics on over the course of the year. And it was really beautiful to get to spend that much time just asking kids about math. So again, that pink section in the diagnostic, you can see there, that was more of a whole class concern. And then you'll notice some of the other ones, like that purple section, there's just a few students that didn't get it and everyone else was green. So whenever we had a few sections like that, what we decided to do was we would have guided groups. And the beautiful thing is that in an elementary classroom, teachers are already often doing guided groups in their literacy blocks. And so they have a sense of what guided groups look like for literacy. And so we try and like mimic that a bit through the math. And so we would kind of set 10 or 15 minutes aside of the end of a class, and we would close some of the gaps through those small guided groups. And so we would target things like, what does half look like? And how are like all the ways half can look, because half could look like an area model, or it could look like a set model, or it could look, so we kind of, not that we're calling it that all the time in grade 1, but we could really like kind of play out what that would look like in many different ways so that the students could be more flexible in the representation of that. And then this blue box around here, this is counting by fives. So in the grade 1 curriculum in Ontario, when we did this diagnostic, counting by fives would have been something that probably would have accomplished midway through, if not by the end of grade 1. And so when we were looking at that, this piece of counting by fives, that's actually something we wouldn't expected the students to have done better. Like, it wouldn't have been something in September that the students would have absolutely right away. So that was kind of where we said, okay, question 7 is actually a marker for us. We know the students shouldn't be able to do this because that's actually a curriculum stop point. The kids don't know how to do that yet. So then we also looked at prime operation. And so an example of one of the questions for prime operation, you show this figure. So it has 4 plus 3, and then 7 plus 5. And what you say to the student is, what is 4 plus 3 more? Try to do this problem thinking in your head or by making a picture in your head. You can, of course, do it any way you want. Then pause. And what is 7 plus 5 more? And so with that question, we're kind of like building off their previous knowledge, like how did they get the first thing? And it's actually kind of like trying to get kids to even think about, like, okay, I had 4 and I went 4, 5, 6, 7, and trying to get them to build off, but doing that in their heads. And so once they have 7, they should be able to count on from there. So that's kind of where we're aiming, or that was what we're hoping for. And so we actually had kind of an interesting result, because everything you think kids can build and do from kindergarten, if you don't actually do the diagnostics, you may have an assumption that they're a lot stronger than they are. And it's not that they can't pick it up really quick, but if you really do know where you start, it is so much easier to show kids how much they've progressed across a timeline. And so the operation, there was a lot more students kind of sitting in that pre-phase 1. And so they were kind of sitting in that early spot again. And it was very helpful to do the operation, because number sense gives you this false sense of security, I think, sometimes when you do the number sense diagnostics. When you do the operations, kids struggle with operations. Like, it doesn't matter what grade level you're in. Operations is a lot harder than talking about numbers and understanding kind of how big or how small or what the magnitude is of a number. And so operations, when it's actually a calculation, a lot of kids really struggle with it. And so that first section, you can see it's only a few students. That was I'm rounding that as like a guided group. And then that question was, if I give you 10 counters, how many groups of 2 can you make? So they can double tap and pull. And what's kind of interesting about that is those 5 students that didn't double tap and pull, or didn't find like how many groups of 2 were in there in any way, and they can move the counters and manipulate it. That's telling us that, like, there's only 5 kids in that class that really, really need to target that, but the other kids have it. So that's a starting point that I can just touch on once in a while. I don't have to spend as much time on it. And sometimes we focus on, or hyper focus even, on things that we think students won't know. And so that was, okay, so now they've got groups of 2, I can maybe focus on groups of 3 or groups of 5 or groups of 4, and not focus so much on groups of 2 anymore, because they've actually got that concept already. And I can just do a targeted intervention for the students that need it. So then the purple one is the whole class, and we've kind of hit a bit of a wall there where you're noticing. But that question is the question from the demo, the 4 plus 3 and then 7 plus 5 more. And so students at the beginning of grade 1, that it's pretty clear, like they wouldn't know how to do that, whether you say plus or you show them the addition sentence. They don't know how to do it. And that's pretty reasonable at the very beginning of grade 1. So having the data collated like that allowed us to organize our thinking, kind of figure it out that we wanted to do guided groups, figured out that we had like some pretty clear stop points, and that there's some things we should clear up before we really roll hard into the curriculum. And so it's a lot easier when the kids are younger to fill the gaps, and gaps are definitely easier to close when they are small. And so if we could close some of the gaps before moving on, that was one methodology. And another methodology that we employed was to like swing back to the gaps every few weeks once we had closed them initially, and then keep coming back to them, so that it was never out of our thought process and out of our minds. So we ended up pretty data rich and a bit overwhelmed, because keep in mind that that was one class data set, and I was working with the whole division. And so we ended up having 4 classes data set that looked like that. And so now we've got everybody's data, and we're trying to look at our whole program, because we're also looking for what are our gaps in our program at the same time. And one of the grade 2 teachers said, I feel really overwhelmed and behind. And it's difficult because everything we've done has been a huge mindset change and challenge for me. And so this just speaks to when you're trying new things and you're taking a lot of risks, it's really important to pause and just appreciate the fact you're doing new things. And doing a diagnostic might not feel like a new thing, but when you're cataloging the diagnostic and you're recording it and you're reflecting on it and you're reviewing it, and you're doing that with other people and talking about your results, that is exhausting and overwhelming. And you need a team, and you really need to be there for each other. And that's one thing, like for somebody to feel connected enough to say, I'm overwhelmed and we're doing a lot of big new things for me, just shows the vulnerability, which I really honestly appreciate, working with people who are willing to be that vulnerable. And I think that that's something that in a lot of the teams that I've worked with and done our research with, we've been really fortunate to have people just be vulnerable and willing to ask questions and say, like, this is overwhelming. And so we actually all kind of felt like it was overwhelming at different points. And so what we did is we said, okay, well, let's go back and let's just focus on a couple of things. And so we did that, and we went back and we just focused on a few things. I am actually going to, yeah. And so the blue lines are looking at, so this was our number sense again. And the blue lines were kind of like, there's our cutoff. Like this blue line is kind of that start of that curriculum, the grade 1 curriculum. So we just want to make sure we're not going to like we're overshooting. And so we're just like, okay, let's first clean these things up here, and then we'll come back and do that later. And so it kind of helped us to kind of like chunk what we were going to focus on. And the same thing, we did the same thing for operations. So a few things just about like key program elements. We decided to use daily number talks. And this is actually something that, because of these programs, I used daily number talks in my high school program as well now, because I really think that the more kids discuss numbers or operations or computation, anything, the more that you talk about math, and the more that you talk about computations and different ways of knowing things and different strategies for solving problems, the better students will get at it, because they're exposed. But it's the number talk. I think the most powerful thing that comes out of doing number talks every day, especially at any age, honestly, is that you're respectfully listening to your peers while they are coming up with interesting strategies. And as the educator in the room, even in high school, like even when I'm doing, like I've done number talks like up to grade 11 and 12, it's pausing and saying, that's a really creative strategy. And if someone had an incorrect answer in it, then can we come back to this in a second, go to another strategy, swing back to this one, and talk a little bit about what happened in the strategy, because these two strategies ended up being really close. One's correct and one isn't. And it was really nice to like be able to go back and like talk about and kind of pick your friend up or pick your peer up with you. And so the daily number talks were a pretty vital program element for us with this project. And it was also one of the hardest things for the teachers to do. Some teachers like jumped on board right away, and others felt like there was a lot of learning around it, because you have to have a bit of a commitment for number talks to work. Like if you do number talks, I usually say like do number talks for 3 days, but do them like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. And if you do them 3 days on the same type of topic, the same type of genre, you're going to have the biggest impact. And so teachers that I worked with would do them for the 3 days, and once they did 3 days, sometimes spending that 10 minutes the next 2 days felt like a good idea and kind of made sense. And so that was, yes. So in elementary, there are a number of authors. Sorry, somebody just asked me if there's a specific program for number talks. So in elementary, there is like a book actually called Number Talks by Sherry Parrish, and highly recommend it. It has DVDs or online clips, so you can actually watch someone do them. You can actually find a lot of number talks online, like on YouTube now, which is kind of cool. But it is best to watch like somebody who's like Sherry Parrish, because she's authored for it. And then Kathy Humphreys is another person that is excellent. Making Number Talks Matter is a great book. So those two books in combination will take you from kindergarten right up to grade 12, well, grade 10 through to 12, because it just gives you enough to kind of see where to go with it. And the first thing I would say for number talks, Melissa, is just to make sure that you like be okay to make mistakes. Like if your number talk doesn't go well the first day, think about, like, reflect on what went well from it, and then kind of make the adjustments to carve out some of the other things. So some things about number talks that we kind of learned with Wrigley bodies is maybe start standing up and then have them sit down when they had a strategy, because the standing up helped their blood flow, and then they would sit down and they'd have their strategy. And then once everybody sat down, we felt like we had our strategies. Some people kind of like have the fist over their heart and just the thumbs up, and the kids will all be seated when they start. So different classrooms did different things, and it kind of depended on the age. And I highly recommend that you do start with dot talks before you start with writing like operations out. The dot talks are really key for the younger kids. And it's actually really a great way to open. I do dot talks in my first couple of grade 9 classes, usually every year too. And I'll have pictures of those in just a second. So we also did a lot of numeracy games, and I actually still use numeracy games in my grade 9 class. And I play a couple of these games, which I'll tell you about in another minute. But I've always loved numeracy games as a math teacher. But I always, like, until about 10 years ago, I think I always felt like I was a high school teacher, and like I shouldn't be putting all these games into my class. And then somebody kind of noticed how much I did it, or kind of noticed like, oh, you're actually like, you gamify a lot of things. And I was like, oh yeah, I do. And I felt kind of relieved that somebody thought it was neat and it wasn't gimmicky, and it was like very much focused on like what math are they getting out of it. And so going into a primary class, and we just talked about, we're just going to launch in numeracy games, and we're not going to worry about the kids writing stuff down initially. We're not going to worry about them, especially grade 1s and 2s. We're not going to worry about them like actually writing numbers. We're going to worry about them talking about the numbers. and use the correct language. And we're going to orally correct them as much as we can because we want them to speak about the math well. And when kids speak things well, then they will write them well. It is to follow. And one thing that I have a bit of a background in is English as a second language. And when you're learning English as a second language, like it is high concentration on your oral language skills, because if you can speak and communicate to someone else, you can access help, you can access anything. But if you can't, then it actually causes a block to how you live your life and survive. And if you take that sort of lens to how you talk and learn about math, it actually helps quite a bit, because if kids can speak math, then they can ask for help. And then they can advocate for themselves. So it kind of goes hand in hand. Is like, if a kid can speak math, they can ask questions. If they can ask questions, then they can reorganize what they're learning about and make it their own. And if they can make it their own, then they've got it. And then they can help others. And so it kind of builds that culture of math talk and language. And then we took, this sounds like a weird element, but took students up on conversations that they were offering. So what I mean by that is, if a kid asked about how big is a million, we laid into it. Like, yeah, it's not curriculum content, but a kid was interested in talking about how big is a million, or how small is tiny. Like, what do these words mean? Or what is infinite? Then we would talk a little bit about it. And some of the kids had older siblings that were in the same school and who were asking actually the same questions. And so when we started talking about it as a group of teachers, and then going back to our classrooms, then we had kind of similar answers that would help kind of like create this collective, and have like age appropriate answers for every class. So those were kind of the key elements. And we're going to look at some things that were really interesting that kind of came out of this. So here is I'm calling them growth pictures from the grade 1 class. So this is September. And you'll notice that I've got these like kind of dots written. So I can't remember what the original picture was, but I had, it was a reck and rack. So I had a magnetized reck and rack on the wall. And so the students said how they saw them. And so like Hunter's got 3 and then 4, but they didn't add them. But Landon did add them, because Landon saw 6 and then 1, so he saw 7. And so after they do the same types of things for a few days, then they'll switch the topic up and we'll cycle back, and you'll see like kind of late October, we're kind of starting to move away, and you're starting to see more numbers get written. And one of the things I have like just over on the right-hand side and the right bottom corner, you can see these like a 15, and it has a 10 and a 5, and then the 10 and 5 kind of overlapped. So I made place value cards, and the kids would overlap them when we would talk about numbers. And we had introduced that as a manipulative pretty recently. And so it was starting to come up in the number talks more frequently. And then in January, you can see a lot of the kids have like moved into it's like a wide variety of strategies in every one of the pictures. And so some kids are like, kids who haven't talked as much are starting to talk. We've told them, like, if you want to use your fingers as much as you can. And some of the kids, like, they weren't actually counting on their hands by January, but they were saying, in my head, I see like my whole hand plus another hand plus another 2. And that was really an interesting thing to start to see, is that they weren't actually counting on their fingers anymore. They were like mentioning that they could see these things. So all of these number talks were based on the gaps that we noticed in the diagnostic. Every one of the number talks, if there was an operations topic, it was based on the diagnostic. If there was something in number sense that had been weak, then it was based, like the number talk was based off of the diagnostic. And so the grade twos had some good summer slide. So we spent a little more time kind of in dot talks initially, and then we kind of grew out of it, and we talked a lot about 10 frames, and we had used 5 frames and 10 frames just to make sure we were rebuilding and rescaffolding some of the stuff from the summer. And so the grade twos, we did a lot with really like friends of 10 and making sure they're really solid, and then how friends of 10 can create friendly numbers like 25. And we started building a lot of stuff like that. And you can see like it went from dot talks and frames, and then you can see these big jumps that now they're really working on their number lines because we've moved from the 10 frames into number lines, and we're starting, you'll see like a lot more of this stack and subtraction sort of leak in here and there, because that's something they were starting to do in and out of class. And then you can start to see like a lot more strategies and how they were doing things and decomposing. And the kids are using dot cards that have also dot and stick cards, that the sticks represent 10 and the dots are the ones. And so you can see that they're, and the base 10 blocks. So you can start to see them in the number talks as well. So that, like, we really addressed whole class gap closure from our data. And we used those number talks, but we also used some games. And so one of the games that we did, so with the younger kids, we played a game called Go Fish, Make 5. And it is exactly what it sounds like. If I have 5 cards in my hand, instead of playing Go Fish and finding the pair, what I would do is if I had a 2, I would ask for a 3 from my partner. And if they didn't have the 3, they would say Go Fish. And if I didn't get the 3 and make my 5 with 2 cards, then I'd give up my turn, I guess, or I'd collect the extra card. And so we played a lot of that in the younger classes, and then we worked our way up to Go Fish, Make 10. And like grade 3s, even like grade 4s love it because it's just reinforcing, and it would be a good, like, here's a 10-minute activity that would help to reinforce. And so when they got to Go Fish, Make 10, say I had those 2 cards left in my hand, I have a 3 and a 6. So I might ask, do you have a 7? And the other player is going to say, no, Go Fish. And then I'm going to go into the pile, and maybe I'm going to pick up that 7. And then I've made our 10. So then my 3 and my 7 make the 10, and I've got my 10. If you are interested, there's like a link down at the bottom that says it's a bit.ly called Meeting Math Needs. You are very welcome to use any of the resources in there. It's a collection of stuff either I've made or I've borrowed, and everybody, if it's been borrowed, their names are on the folder. And I have like their links to their information inside the folders, but it's just a big giant Google Drive that has like all kinds of games that I've used and games that I hang up on my classroom walls and things like that. Another game that I play, and I play this game in my grade 9 classes as well, just to make sure that students are working on multiplication all the time, because it comes up in so many things. And if we don't have good proportional reasoning in grade 9, then linear relations get really difficult, and then everything with functions get even more difficult as we head down the line of high school. So with Salute, you can play it with addition or multiplication. Some people try it with differences. I find that one a little bit hard. But if it's addition, player 1 has this card up on their forehead like that, and they can't see the card number, and the player 2's got their card up on their forehead, and the third player says, I'm going to do a multiplication for this one. You multiply to 18. And so if I'm player 1 and I see the other person is 6, and I know we multiply it to 18, I'm going to say, I'm 3. And so then I can figure out, I can practice my multiplication in another way. And if it's addition or subtraction, I can practice my addition or subtraction using that as well. And so those games are, again, really, really powerful because they can be 10-minute games. And once your class has learned a couple of the games, you can make them harder by adding larger numbers to them. You can make the challenge a little bit different. Like we put in 0s and up to 12 in grade 9. And I don't put the 0s in until the kids are ready for it because it's kind of, it feels unfair sometimes. But they're really helpful, and they do close a lot of gaps that are based around their multiplication. And then here's a few other things, and these are some of the activities and templates and things that you'll find in that drive that was put up with the meeting math needs. And so you can do shake and make 10. So you shake a cup of dice, pour the dice over, and then try and sort it out so you can make 10. So you try and make as many collective 10s as you can. And it doesn't matter how many dice you use. And then you can see kids kind of playing war with dot cards from G. Fletchy. And there's concept circles from Kathy Marks Capan. And then I don't know how many number lines I made, but I made every single class probably 20 number lines and laminated them and had them ready for kids for all different uses. But one of the games that we would play in the younger grades was Race to the Top. And this year in my grade 9 D-Stream class, one of the things that had happened is I had students ask me, do you count the tick or the space when you're using a number line? And I haven't had that question for about 5 years. And it comes up every once in a while. But with the pandemic, there is definitely a few gaps around the tick mark for like how do you count a number line? And that's really what it is. Like, so graphing then becomes much more difficult if students don't know how to use their number lines. And sometimes I think we forget how interconnected these things, and we take for granted the fact that we have that skill to read and understand a number line. But like kids playing Race to the Top, kids, like you're jumping to the next number and you count the jump. And that was like a big piece in grade 1, is we were counting the jump. And so then those questions, they get alleviated because that gap is closed in grade 1. We had lots of different grouping activities and grouping games. And this is those dot cards I was talking about with G. Fletchy. So those games were really helpful. And again, those games are in those folders for meeting the math needs. And we actually sent home at the end of the year, we sent home family packets for all of these dot card games from G. Fletchy. And they help so that there wouldn't be as much summer slide the next year. And so students wouldn't be starting back half the growth that they had gained. With the whole class versus guided groups, just a few things that we tried or did. So we had questions that we had to ask ourselves. So for the instructors, it was how big are the gaps? So how far back do we actually have to start? And how many students do the gaps impact? So is this whole class or is this just a guided group? Like, is it going to be while the other kids are playing one game and having a round of the game that they can do independently after they've been taught how to play the game, then I can take these 4 or 5 kids and work on closing that gap, playing the game with them, or working with them on other instructional activities that'll help to close those gaps. Some of the questions I asked myself as the facilitator is, do educators already use guided groups in literacy? And we mentioned that at the start. And if they don't already use, like if an educator didn't already use guided groups for literacy, guided groups in math might be harder, or it might take a little more training for the teacher, because they have to train their students how guided groups work. And often if it's already existing in literacy, the kids already have a good idea for what it looks like. And do guided groups have to be scheduled. So one of the things that this was kind of a big idea for our crew was the guided groups we used. I feel like guided groups should be spontaneous. And so if there's 10 minutes where you can pull kids off to the side and sort of like close a gap, but you're consistently working to close that gap, it to me doesn't matter where the 10 minutes is. So if the 10 minutes is at the start where there's students are doing a different activity, then you could have a small guided group. Because if you can make it a smaller group and do it 10 minutes when kids are doing some practice work, or you can pull kids aside when the other kids are all playing games, so then it just looks like you're playing a game. It also helps to kind of like remove some of the stigma around getting the guided groups. And as they get older, students, there is a bit of a stigma depending on how the guided groups are used. And so then we also talked about like, should we make some like do some guided groups so it's a little bit of enrichment for everybody? And so there was a little bit of discussion around that. And can guided groups occur organically through gap closing games and activities? So are those guided groups how the grouping has occurred? Like, do we group them into a guided group and then just play a game with the kids? So that's what we kind of meant by more organically, which we did, and it was pretty helpful. Okay. Yes, I will double check the link in just by the end. So just a few things that we kind of noticed. So checkpoints and growth. So we noticed that students found new games and activities to be a challenge, but they got easier over time. The oral math communication improved a lot. They identified strategies. The identification of strategies improved. So students were actually like naming what they were doing, and their questions improved. So they got a lot more rigorous in their questions. And and we wondered just about if students were memorizing things, because you know when they first like you first learn to count, you'll like memorize the counting, and then could they transfer the skills? So was it something that was oral communication or problem solving? Could they use that skill at in any of their other problem solving? And would we be able to cover the curriculum? That was actually obviously the hugest of our questions. And really interesting, because once we got going, we were covering our curriculum a lot faster because the kids had a better understanding the whole way through. So April data collection came along, and this is our Diagnostic A this was our original one from September. And this is what A looked like in April. So this is early April. And we also we went straight into the next diagnostic, and we got into, the kids were just starting kind of like, they were into almost grade 2 level, and they'd only been doing the program like until early April. So that was a really positive experience. And so what that all looked like together. So here's Diagnostic A from September. So it's late September and then early April. So it's about 6 months, not quite. And the kids really showed a lot of growth. And they have something similar. I'm just going to like pop through on the operation data. So this is something similar. So the operation data looked very similar. So we're into Diagnostic B as well. So you can see a lot of the growth. So we've gone from red and yellow to quite a bit of green, and this is in 6 months. And so the grade 1 educator commented and said, I feel like we focused on a lot less, but we did it thoroughly, and we kept coming back to these main ideas regularly, and they just seemed to get it so much better. So the grade 1 educator has been teaching that program for like 25 years, pretty close to retirement, and had said like she felt like a lot more like renewed in her strategies, and was really excited to keep teaching and to kind of use those strategies more. And another kind of comment was students are getting so much stronger after using transition activities. So one teacher called them games and another teacher referred to them as transition activities because they'd use them anytime they had 10 minutes to transition. And that little bit of regular questioning, it's been so good and positive. They all want to tell me they got it. So this was actually a really big piece for the primary teachers, that the kids really, they were like at their feet and like pulling at the, you know how the younger kids will like pull at your hip to tell you, I got it, I got to show you how much I did. So overall, this is what the student learning looked like. A full phase of growth in 16 of the 17 grade 1s in 6 months, and a full phase of growth in 12 out of the 13 grade 2s in 6 months, full phase of growth. This is like a year's worth of learning, basically, in 12 of the 16 grade 3s in 5 months, and then a full phase of growth in 13 of the 21 grade 4s in 5 months. So just a disclaimer with the grade 4s, they had 3 different teachers in 1 year. And so that some of that was like, they ended up doing the same initial step a couple of times before they had, the teacher was the same. So then for student voice, the grade 1s, they did like a survey with me at the start and at the end. And by the end, they were like, we love number talks, dot cards, and salute, and number line games. Like they loved them. Every time they'd see me in the hallway, they'd be like, Miss Math Lady, come play this with us. And it was super fun. And then the grade 2s, it said, they loved the games and they loved all the physical games. So they liked doing the number talks, which they would talk about as a game, but then they loved any game where they got up and moved. And so we, like some of the games, we made the tiles became the number line. So they had to do so many jumps, or they had to skip jump sometimes. And so they loved those kind of games. And the grade 3s loved all the card games. Salute was their favorite. They were working on multiplication, and so it was a little more like the one we were talking about. So some of the things that the teachers said that they learned in the process, main concepts that they spent time on were the number talks. That was a big learning, and it was a huge learning curve. And then planning number talks was a huge learning curve, because once you get into it, you can follow the book for so long, but then you do have to take that initial dive away from it, and then you start really planning your own, and sequencing them is a lot harder. Pam Harris has number strings, and she talks about number strings as well. And I think Sherry Parrish has some number strings in her book as well. Joe Bowler also talks about number strings, and it's like planning that like string of number talks that you could do like one right after the other. But the first couple of times that the teachers did number talks on their own, they took like 20 minutes to do them because they weren't sure when to stop. And then we got to a point, it was like, okay, plan to go for 5 and it'll go for 10, and that's an appropriate amount. Cut it off at 10 minutes, because the whole idea is that they're short, but they keep coming back to the same idea. So you're going to have 3 to 5 of the same topic, but pulling out different strategies all through the week. And then the numeracy games, it was just finding the games, making sure you had appropriate materials, building some of the materials that we didn't have, and then adjusting numeracy games so that there wouldn't be boredom, and that students could always increase their level and get to the next stage. And then every one of the teachers were like, I did not realize how important number lines were, because once kids had number lines in their hands and could physically like actually move characters up and down the number lines, they were like, wow, like the kids talked about numbers differently. They visualized numbers moving up and down the number line, which when we get to high school and kids already have that idea of moving back and forth on a number line and like using that difference concept when they're talking about subtraction, they've already got that visually and they're thinking about that in their head. That makes a huge difference when you're talking about integers when you get to grade 7 and 8. Some other things that we learned about was base 10s and base 10 activities and how to skip count and talk about place value and using base 10 materials for adding and subtraction. We talked about visual multiplication as they got into grade 3 and 4. We talked about obviously a big piece was about reading the data and then always going back to the data. And we used the prime continuum, which was in the prime diagnostic kit by Marion Small. And then we also used the Alex Lawson continuum. And Alex Lawson's a really great math ed researcher and educator who has like a really great layout for kind of where kids are and how their learning is overlapping. Now, the big question at the end of this was, will you use diagnostics as part of your math program in the future? And so we asked all of the teachers that were engaged in this, and they said yes. One big thing that kind of came out of this was a lot of the teachers kind of felt like it was really overwhelming to do all the diagnostics because they have literacy diagnostics and numeracy diagnostics to do. And they just felt like that was a big support piece and that part was difficult. And so in my recommendations for the school was to make sure that there was support so that maybe the admin team can come in and like support by watching the kids so that they can do some of the diagnostics, which was actually volunteered by the admin themselves. They thought that was a pretty good idea and a great way to get to know the kids every year. So my personal takeaways from the project was that we use diagnostics, use them all the time, collect them and code it and find what questions gave gaps and use the diagnostic manuals to understand the point of the question. So then you can understand what the actual gap means and why the gap exists. And then you can, if you can determine a question that the whole class has a gap, or if it's just something that needs to be addressed in a guided group. And then with my own experience as a grade 9 D-stream math teacher, I use prime number and operation every single term. I send out a letter to parents to let them know kind of what gaps we have. And in Ontario, we have a support, online support called EduGains, and it is all for gap closure. So if you go to edugains.ca, you'll actually see, like, you can access it from other countries as well. And EduGains has gap closures for grades 6 and 9, and they're all broken down by different strands, and it's really helpful. And so I use that data then to plan all of my number talks and what I call thin slices to target gap closure and to continually repeat curriculum ideas and have them come up in class every day. So I truly believe diagnostics are for everyone in every course, and I hope that after today, that might be something you would also see. So again, I'm Kat Hendry, and thanks for chatting. There's a few of the links that are up there. If you want to see the summer packets that I sent home, that's in that family math packets. And it's also in the Meeting the Math Needs drive. Does anybody have questions?
Thank you very much, Kat, for sharing with us. I hope you'll be able to stick around for a few more minutes to answer questions. Everyone in attendance, thank you for joining us tonight. This will be our last webinar this school year. Our first session in August will be August 9th, Beyond Right Answer, Math Tasks That Foster Agency and Identity with Tuana Young.
Did the links end up working? I can see that Dave put one out. Okay. I will, just one sec. But did the family math packet one work okay?
Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, perfect. Okay.
Yeah, perfect.
Thank you very much,
So
Kat, for sharing with us. Everyone in
thank you.
attendance, thank you for joining us tonight. This will be our last webinar this school year. Our first session in August will be August 9th, Beyond Right Answer, Math Tasks That Foster Agency and Identity with Tuana Young. Good night, everyone.
Thank you and good night.